In order to solve a quadratic equation, the equation must be in factored form. To put an equation into factored form, you need to factor it using one or more techniques. In our previous lesson, we learned how to factor a quadratic expression using the common factoring method. In this video, we will look at a second technique called decomposition. Before we begin, let's quickly go over a couple of practice questions on solving quadratic equations. So remember, in order to solve a quadratic equation, you need two conditions that have to be met. The first is that your equation has to be equal to 0 or set equal to 0. And the second condition is that your equation has to be factored. And remember that you know that your equation is factored when you see an equation or an expression that has brackets. To solve, you're going to take each bracket, look at them separately, and you're going to set them equal to 0. And then with each expression, you can solve for x. So you are going to isolate for x by collecting or separating terms. And so one of our answers is going to be +1. And our other answer is going to be -2. Remember that for quadratic equations, most quadratic equations will have two possible answers for x. So we can do the same thing with question B. We look at each bracket separately, we set it equal to 0, and then we're going to go ahead and isolate for x. So for the first expression, 2x minus 1, okay, we're going to bring the 1 over to the right-hand side. And then to isolate for x, we need to divide both sides by 2. So one answer will be 1/2. And then for our other expression, 2x plus 1, we'll bring 1 over to the right-hand side, making it -1. And then we're going to divide both sides by 2. So x will be -1/2. And in example C, we've got x plus 4 squared equals 0. Remember that the squared means that you're going to write out your bracket twice. So we've got x plus 4 multiplied by x plus 4. Now, these are the same expressions, just written out twice. So it's really up to you. I mean, technically, yes, you should show your work and solve for x twice like you normally do. However, because they are the same expression, you're just going to get the same answer. So if we solve for x, we're going to find that x is equal to -4, but you're going to get the same thing when you solve the second one. So really, for this particular quadratic equation, there is only one answer for x. X is equal to -4. And there are some situations where there will only be one answer for x. All right, now we're ready to look at how to factor quadratic equations using the decomposition method. So in our last lesson, we learned how to factor using common factoring. And common factoring is always going to be your very first step when it comes to factoring, meaning that whenever you get a quadratic equation and you want to factor it, you should always start by checking to see if there is a common factor that you can pull out. So here's an example of a quadratic equation that I want to factor. So we've got 0 equals x squared plus 5x plus 6. So the first step is, are there any common factors between all three of these terms? So is there something that they have in common? So let's start with looking at the numbers or the coefficients in the equation. So remember that in front of the x squared, we don't see a value, but there is a 1 at the very front. So the numbers that we have to work with here are 1, 5, and 6. So are there any common factors between 1, 5, and 6? Well, the only number that can go evenly into 1, 5, and 6 is 1. But I mean, 1 goes into every number, so 1 isn't really a valid common factor. Instead, let's look at variables because this equation does have some variables. So we've got an x squared, and we have an x. There is no variable attached to the 6. So do all three of these terms in this equation have a variable in common? And the answer to that is no, because yes, there is an x squared in the first term, so there's an x here. Yes, there is an x in the second term, but there is no x in the third term. So x is not something that all three of these terms have in common. So there's no number that we can pull out, and there's no variable that we can pull out. So there is no common factors that we can use. So common factoring is not going to help us factor this equation. So we need to then proceed on to a different method. And that method that we're going to use is called decomposition. So decomposition is best used when you have a quadratic equation that is in a specific format. And that format is given to us here. So we're looking for a quadratic equation that follows this template. So something x squared, then you have a term in the middle with an x, and then you have a term at the end of the equation that's just a plain number. So if you look at this template and compare it to the equation that we're working with, you can see that it matches up. Our first term has an x squared, our middle term has an x, and our last term, or the third term, is just a plain number. The next thing you want to do is identify three very specific particular values. And those values are your A value, your B value, and your C value. So if we go back and look at the template of our quadratic equation, you'll see these letters A, B, and C, and they're in very particular spots. So the A value is the value that is attached or in front of your x squared term. So if we take a look at our equation and our x squared term, we don't necessarily see a number in the front, but remember we know that if we don't see a number, the value there is 1. So our A value is 1. The B value is the value that is attached or in front of the x. So if we look at our equation, our B value would be 5. And the C value is the number found at the very end of your equation. So our C value would be 6. So the steps for decomposition factoring are listed on your screen or on your handout. The first step is to find two numbers that will multiply to A times C. But these same two numbers should also add up to give you your B value. Once you figure out what those two numbers are, you're going to rewrite the expression and replace the B term in the original expression with the two numbers that you came up with in step 1. And then our final step is to factor by grouping. So we're going to go through all three of these steps very slowly using the equation that we were just looking at. All right, so our first step is going to be to multiply our A value by our C value. So for us, that's going to be 1 multiplied by 6, which is 6. So what we need to figure out, and it's going to take a little bit of mental math, we need to come up with two numbers that will multiply to give us 6, but those same two numbers have to add together to give us 5. And 5 is our B value. Okay, so we need two numbers that are going to multiply to give us 6. And those same two numbers have to add together to give us 5. So a little bit of quick thinking, and I know that my numbers have to be 3 and 2. 3 times 2 is 6, so that works out. And 3 plus 2 is 5. So that works out. So those are going to be our two magic numbers. The next thing we want to do is take our two magic numbers and insert them into our equation. So by inserting the 3 and the 2 into the equation, what we are going to do is stick them in the place of the 5x. So in essence, we are kind of just getting rid of this 5x. And instead, we are going to write this. So we have the 0, we have the equal sign, we're recopying the x squared. And now I'm going to insert my two magic numbers. So one of my numbers was a positive 3. I'm going to attach an x to it okay? Because remember that the middle term in our quadratic expression here has to have an x. So we are sticking our magic numbers into the middle, so we also need to put in the x. We can't lose that x. That's a key component of our quadratic equation. So one of my magic numbers was a positive 3. My other magic number was a positive 2. And again, I'm going to attach an x to it. And then I'm just going to recopy the end number, which was a positive 6. Okay, our next step is to factor by grouping. So what factoring by grouping means is we are going to group together the first two terms in our equation. So I'm just going to put some brackets around them. So I did that in blue. And then we're going to group together the second two terms of our equation. So I put a red set of brackets around those. And now we are going to factor each set of brackets separately. And by factoring, I mean you are going to common factor each set. So let's look at the brackets encased in blue. So we've got x squared plus 3x inside my blue bracket. So is there anything that these two terms have in common? And the answer is yes, they both have an x in common. I know that x can go into x squared, and I know that x can go into itself. Okay, in terms of numbers, well, there's a 1 in front of the x squared, and there's a 3 over here. There's no common factors between 1 and 3 other than 1, and we don't really care about 1. So the only thing that they do have in common is an x. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to recopy the 0, I'm going to recopy the equal sign, and I'm going to write an x because that was the common factor between x squared and 3x. Okay, I'm going to open the bracket again. I'm going to recopy my expression. And each term is going to get divided out by their common factor of x. Okay, I have a plus sign. And now I'm going to check my second set. So between 2x and 6, is there anything that these two terms have in common? So let's look at the numbers. We've got 2 and a 6. So are there any common factors between 2 and 6? And the answer is yes. 2 can go into 2, and 2 can also go into 6. That is the greatest common factor between 2 and 6. Now, are there any letters or variables that these two terms have in common? And the answer to that is no. I mean, 2x has an x, but there is no letter attached to the 6, so there are no variables in common. The only thing that they have in common is a 2. So I'm going to write a 2, since that's the common factor here. I'm going to open a bracket. I'm going to recopy the expression. And each term is going to get divided by its common factor of 2. All right, our next step is now to just do this division. So we've got an x. Inside my bracket, I'm going to do x squared divided by x, which is x. We have a plus sign. And then I've got 3x divided by x. Remember, if you see an x on the top and an x on the bottom, that's going to cancel out. And so the only thing that's going to be left is 3. Then I have a plus sign. I have a 2, and now I'm going to perform the division inside this bracket. So I've got 2x divided by 2. So 2 divided by 2 is 1. I don't have to write the 1. So the only thing that would be left over here is an x. I've got a plus sign, and 6 divided by 2 is 3. All right, so let's pause here and take a look at what we have just come up with. Do you see anything that appears twice? So notice inside the first bracket is an x plus 3. Inside the second bracket is also an x plus 3. So this is a sign that you did the factoring correctly. You should be able to generate the same expression inside each of your brackets. If one of our brackets was x plus 3 and then it was x plus some other number here, we would know that something was wrong. You should get the same exact expression inside your brackets. So our last step is to write our final answer. And so this is how we're going to write our final answer. We've got a 0. You're going to open a bracket. And inside this first bracket, you are going to write out the expression that appears twice. So for us, that is x plus 3. So I'm going to put x plus 3 inside this bracket. Then you're going to open up a second bracket, and you are going to take the terms that are just kind of floating around and hanging out, and you are going to put them together inside this second bracket. So for us, that would be the x and the plus 2. We are going to put them together, and we're going to write that as x plus 2. So our final factored equation is 0 equals x plus 3, x plus 2. So if you want to check and see if your answer is right, you could take our answer and you could FOIL it. You could expand it out. And you should be able to regenerate our original equation of x squared plus 5x plus 6. If you FOIL this and you don't get back your original equation, that means something went wrong somewhere along the lines, probably in the middle of your decomposition formula. And so you can always go back and make a correction. Okay, now we're going to go through some practice questions together, and you'll also get a chance to pause the video and try some on your own, and then come back to the video to check your answer. So here's our first example. We've got x squared minus 2x minus 8. So we are asked to solve each equation by factoring. So remember, no matter what type of equation you get, the very first thing that you should be checking for first is, are there any common factors that you can remove from the equation? So if we take a look at the terms, we've got x squared, 2x, and 8. So in terms of numbers, we've got 1, 2, and 8. There are no common factors between 1, 2, and 8. And in terms of variables, well, there's a variable in the first term, there's a variable in the second term, but there isn't a variable in the third term. So they don't even have letters or variables in common. So we cannot common factor this expression. If we look at the format of this equation, we see that we've got an x squared term, a term in the middle with an x, and a plain number on the end. So this tells us that this would be a great equation that could be factored using the decomposition method. So the first thing that we're going to do is list out our a, b, and c values. So I'm going to do that here on the side. So my a value is 1. My b value is -2. Make sure that when you are reading off your values, you also pay attention to the sign that is attached to it. And my c value is a -8. The next thing we're going to do is take our a value and multiply it with our c value. So for us, that would be 1 multiplied by -8, which is -8. So we need two numbers that are going to multiply to give us -8, and those same two numbers have to add together to give us our b value, and our b value is -2. So take a couple of seconds, figure out or think of what two numbers could work in both of these scenarios. So numbers that will work out for us would be -4 and 2. -4 times 2 is -8, and -4 plus 2 is -2. So -4 and +2 are going to be our magic numbers. So our next step is to take our two magic numbers of -4 and +2 and insert them into the middle of our equation. So we're still going to keep the 0, we're still going to keep the equal sign, we're going to keep the x squared, and then I inserted -4, attached an x to it. My second magic number was a +2, so here's my +2. I attach an x to that, and we keep the number from the very end of the equation, which is a -8. So now our next step is to group together our terms. So I'm going to group together the first and the second term, and I'm going to group together the third and the fourth term. you are now going to common factor each individual set. So when I look at my first set of brackets, I've got x squared and 4x. So the only common factor that they have in common is an x. So I'm going to put down an x, I'm going to open up a bracket, I'm going to recopy the expression, and each of these terms is going to get divided out by my common factor of x. I'm going to put a plus sign, and now I'm going to look for a common factor between 2x and 8. So again, there isn't an x that appears in both terms, so I know that there is no variable that is a common factor. However, 2 and 8, well, 2 can go into 2, so 2 is a factor of 2, and 2 is also a factor of 8. So they have a common factor of 2, and then I'm going to open the bracket, I'm going to recopy the expression 2x minus 8, and each of these is going to get divided by 2. So inside my first bracket, I've got x squared divided by x, and that's going to give me x, minus 4x divided by x, that's going to work out to be 4. Then I've got plus 2, my second bracket, and inside my second bracket, I have 2x divided by 2, which is x. I have a minus sign, and then I have 8 divided by 2, which is 4. So again, you can check and see if you did this correctly, because if you look at what's inside your brackets, it should be exactly the same. So I've got x minus 4 and x minus 4 in my second bracket as well. So I know that I've done my factoring correctly. So my final step is to write the final factored equation. So remember, you're going to create 2 sets of brackets. In the first bracket, I like to write out the expression that showed up twice. And so for us, that was x minus 4. Shows up twice, so I'm just going to write it out in the first bracket. And then in my second bracket, remember, you are grouping together kind of like the leftover pieces that weren't inside a bracket. So for us, that would be the x plus 2. So our final answer, or final factored answer, would be x minus 4 times x plus 2. So here's our second example. We've got a squared minus 13a equals negative 36. So remember that anytime you want to factor a quadratic equation, the equation has to be equal to 0. Right now, the way that this equation is set up, it's set equal to negative 36. So in order to make this equation equal to 0, I'm going to take this negative 36 and I'm going to bring it over to the left-hand side so that all of my terms are on one side of the equation, and that's going to leave nothing on the right-hand side. So our equation now is going to be a squared minus 13a plus 36 equals 0. So now we're good to go. So always your first step is to check and see if there's a common factor that can be removed. And if I quickly scan my terms, there is no common factor between all 3 of these terms. So that means I can't use common factoring, so I'm going to try to proceed to use decomposition. So before I do that, I'm going to list out my a value, which is 1, my b value, which is negative 13, and my c value, which is 36. I need to take my a value and multiply it by my c value. So for us, that's going to be 1 multiplied by 36, which is 36. So I need 2 numbers that are going to multiply to give me 36, but those same 2 numbers need to add together to give me my b value, which happens to be negative 13. So let's do some quick mental math. And the numbers that are going to work are negative 9 and negative 4. Negative 9 times negative 4 is positive 36. And negative 9 plus negative 4 is negative 13. So our 2 magic numbers that we're going to insert back into our quadratic equation are negative 9, negative 4. So I've gone ahead and inserted my 2 numbers into my equation, and now I'm going to go ahead and group. So I'm going to group together the first 2 terms, and I'm going to group together the second two terms. Now, be careful, this one is a little bit different. In the last two examples that we worked on, the operation that was in the center was a positive. However, this one has a negative. So it's up to you. You could group together the negative with your second set, or you could choose to leave it out. Just be careful with the signs. My suggestion is always going to be to group the negative inside the bracket. And as I show you the rest of the solution, you'll kind of see why that is. So our next step is to common factor each bracket. So I'm going to start with the first one. So between a squared and 9a, our common factor is a. So I'm going to recopy a squared minus 9a, and then each of these terms is going to get divided out by a. Okay, so now when you look at the second set, okay, you're going to say to yourself, well, what do 4a, so just the 4a, what do 4a and 36 have in common? So there are no variables that they have in common because only the first term here has the a, 36 doesn't have any attached to it. Okay, but 4 can go into 4, and 4 can also go into 36. So 4 is going to be our common factor. However, when you state that over here, okay, you're also going to carry out the negative with it. Okay, or you can think of it like a subtraction sign if you want to. So you're just going to kind of pull it out of the blue bracket. And then when you open your bracket and you recopy the expression, you're recopying negative 4a plus 36. And each of these terms is going to get divided out by negative 4. Okay, so I went ahead and performed the division, and I know that I did it correctly because inside each of my brackets, I wound up with the expression a minus 9. So now for my final answer, I've got two brackets. My equation is still equal to 0. My brackets are going to be a minus 9 and a minus 4. So our final example is y equals 3x squared plus 11x plus 6 when y is equal to 0. So that just tells you that wherever you see the letter y in the equation, you are going to replace it with a 0. So I'm just going to go ahead and insert that in its place. Okay, and then you're now ready to factor. So I'm going to suggest that you pause the video and try this one on your own. Remember, always check and see if there's a common factor that you can pull out first. If not, you can then go ahead and proceed to factor using decomposition. So pause the video to give it a try, and when you come back to the video, the full solution will be there for you on the screen. So here's the full solution to this question. Take some time to look at it and check that all of your steps are correct. As you start to become more confident with common factoring, it won't be necessary to show me the division that happens inside each of the brackets. You can skip that step. However, until you become confident with that step, I suggest that you include it so that you can get more comfortable and more confident with your factoring skills. With question D, the same thing kind of applies here. You need to have your equation equal to 0, but this equation is set equal to 2. So you can bring the 2 over to the right-hand side, but by doing so, you are going to end up with some like terms that you can put together. Once you collect like terms, you're left with 4x squared minus 8x minus 5, and now you're ready to go ahead and factor the equation. So pause the video, try the factoring, and then come back to see the full solution. So your final answer should work out to 2x minus 5 multiplied by 2x plus 1. Be careful with this one. Depending on the order in which you place your two magic numbers, the factoring might work out to be a little bit different. So if you didn't place your magic numbers in the same order that I did, so maybe you put the 2x first and then the negative 10x, your factoring might look a little bit different. However, you should still come out with the same exact answer that I got here. For me, when I was looking for a common factor between 2x and 5, the only thing that they have in common is a 1. Now, normally we wouldn't write in this 1 in front of the bracket, but remember, you need to group together these two numbers that I'm highlighting in yellow to come up with one of your factors at the end. So you need to put in the 1 when you are showing your factoring process. In the final equation, 3y cubed minus 21y squared minus 24y, we want to do the exact same factoring that we've been looking at in this lesson. Remember, your very first step is to always check if there is a common factor that can be pulled out first before you start using decomposition. So if I look at my equation, I've got constants or coefficients of 3, 21, and 24. So between these three numbers, there is a common factor between them of 3. So I can pull out a 3. But then we also have variables in this equation. We've got y cubed, y squared, and y. So the common factor between these three sets of variables is a y. So I can pull out a common factor first of 3y, and then remember everything inside the bracket is going to get divided out by our common factor of 3y. So that's going to leave me with y squared minus 7y minus 8. So this factor is still not yet completely or fully factored. So we've common factored it, but the portion that is left over inside the bracket, it still follows that same template or that same format. Something squared, something in the middle with a letter, and a plain number at the end. So it's a trinomial that follows that same template, and that template can undergo the process of decomposition. So you want to try to factor this portion here, this trinomial, using the decomposition method. So give this one a try, pause the video, see if you can factor and come up with the correct answer. And when you're ready to see the answer, you can come back to the video. So take some time to look through the solution for this question. Your final answer should work out to be 3y, y minus 8 times y plus 1.